In this lesson, I want to introduce you to divs and spans. And what divs and spans do is they allow us to actually break up our HTML content without adding any additional formatting. So let's say, for instance, I want to highlight this word. I could add in a span, and a span essentially is an HTML element that isn't going to change how my content is getting output. So I can put them all over the place, and when I go out to the web page, it's actually not going to be any different. I'm going to get rid of my highlighting here because I want to get I don't want that whole paragraph to be highlighted. I refresh it, and we actually don't know where our spans are located. But the cool thing about spans is that now we can add in attributes into it. So we can add in that class of highlight into this span if we want, or into this span, or maybe into this span. And maybe this one we'll just keep as it is. So we can update, we can select the spans just like we did any other tag. So I want to add in a border around there, and I can also add in for the class the highlight of yellow. So let's take a look and see what this looks like now. So we see that all of the spans get the border around it because it's just selecting that styling on that particular class. But the interesting thing here is that we're able to highlight different pieces of content in different ways, and we can really break apart that content. So there is another, essentially a container that we can use to really structure our HTML code. A lot of times you might have seen it used maybe to wrap the entire page. So instead of just using our body, we can do something like div id wrapper or something like that. Close that off, and we could wrap a whole bunch of our content. You might also see it being used for and you can place these within so divs within other divs and so on. So I can have another div, and maybe this area here represents my header. So I've got my H1 here and so on. So I've got some head content here, and I'm just going to add in some additional content here, close that one off and save it, make it look nice, beautify. And now let's refresh, and we can see that the divs, they're actually taking up the full width block, but most of all, they're allowing us to break apart and look at our content as if it was in pieces. So just like what we looked at with HTML head and body, the divs allow us to really break apart this content into more meaningful sections of our web page. So we've got one div that wraps this one, and now maybe we want to have another div here, give it an ID of main. So this would be all of our main content here. And we'll just go down to maybe all of this stuff is within main, and I want to have another div here and give it an ID of footer. And just to add in some content here, make it look nice again. Go back out to our page, check it out, and we see that basically we've gotten to break apart our content using these divs. Divs automatically start a new line. So if I was to wrap this one in a div, and I'm not going to give this div an ID, so you don't need to specify those attributes. The attributes are not mandatory within divs, and we see that what happens here when this div breaks, it automatically starts a new line there because the div actually takes up that entire block of code. So it's actually, sorry, this one, that's the div. We see that the div, just like the H1s, so they have the same properties as the H1s, same properties as the paragraphs, takes up that whole block of code. So if I was to actually specify, instead of there, if I wanted to do div, so we can see what the div looks like as opposed to the span. So quickly, this is still the span. We see that the span only contains that particular section. So it's inline, it doesn't break anything, it doesn't look any different until we apply some styling to it. So take a look at what happens to the divs. When we refresh them, we see that the divs move all the way to the end. They take up the full available line of code. So this div here is taking up that full line. The footer is taking up the full line. We've got the wrapper taking up the full line, the header taking up the full line, and so on. So divs and spans essentially used to build that structure within your web pages and to create some smarter breaking and structure within your content of your web page. So building out your website, building out your structure, look at it as different sections, different pieces, use those divs, use those spans to break those apart and better represent that content. And especially when you're thinking applying styling, make sure you've got those divs nicely laid out and ready to be able to accommodate styling as you add it into the web page. So now one other thing here that we're probably looking at and that we should be considering is that we want it to work as an HTML5 page. So using divs and using spans, especially divs, so this is an older way of thinking. Originally when we were designing our web pages, we didn't have additional options, so we would create divs, we'd give them IDs of footers. But when HTML5 came along, they realized that web developers were commonly doing the same thing. We were giving these IDs for the divs, and they were looking for a more semantic, a more meaningful words for breaking apart your content, and this was all brought in with HTML5. So with HTML5, we got a whole bunch of new tags that we can utilize in order to better structure our web pages. And all of these new semantic ones, a lot of them, they work the same way as divs, but they allow us to have more meaning when you're reading through that HTML code. So I'm going to show you and introduce you to those in the upcoming lesson.